August 6, 1945 marked the day the world changed forever. Though Keiko Nakamura would not learn this truth for months. Inside the concrete walls of the Rabaul internment camp on the island of New Britain, she and 73 other Japanese civilian women existed in a reality carefully constructed by their own military's relentless propaganda machine. For years they had been told that American soldiers were monsters, incarnate savage beasts who delighted in torturing prisoners, desecrating bodies, and committing unspeakable atrocities against women and children. The Imperial Japanese government's Ministry of Information had distributed countless pamphlets, radio broadcasts, and newsreels depicting U.S. Marines as demonic figures with grotesque features, their hands perpetually stained with innocent blood. Keiko, a 32-year-old nurse from Yokohama, had followed her husband to the South Pacific when he received his military posting in 1942. She had witnessed the gradual tightening of the noose around Japan's Pacific territories, the dwindling supply lines, and the increasingly desperate measures taken by Japanese command. When Allied forces captured Rabaul in early 1945, she and the other Japanese civilians, mostly nurses, teachers, and military wives, were separated from the soldiers and placed in a makeshift detention facility. The Japanese officers, before their own surrender, had gathered the women and delivered one final, chilling warning. If the Americans take you alive, death would be a mercy. They will do things to you that will make you beg for the honor of seppuku. These words haunted Keiko through the sweltering tropical nights. She had heard the stories whispered among the women tales of what happened at Nanking, though the details were always vague and carefully sanitized by their own propagandists who blamed Chinese provocateurs for any violence. Yet the message was clear. War was brutal, and the Americans, they were assured, were far worse than anything the Imperial Army had ever done. Historical records from the National Archives, as documented in various post-war testimonies, reveal that this psychological warfare was deliberate and systematic, designed to prevent surrender and encourage Japanese civilians and soldiers to fight to the death rather than face capture. The camp itself was a collection of deteriorating military barracks surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers that now stood empty. The Japanese guards had vanished days ago, leaving the women in a strange limbo. Some spoke of mass suicide, recalling the tragic deaths at Saipan where hundreds of Japanese civilians had thrown themselves from cliffs rather than surrendered to American forces. Keiko had watched mothers clutch their children closer, seen the hardening of resolve in eyes too young to have witnessed such horror. The youngest among them, Yuki Tanaka, was barely 18, a schoolteacher's daughter who had come to New Britain to marry a naval officer killed months earlier at Leyte Gulf. On this particular morning, as the tropical sun climbed toward its zenith and the air grew thick with humidity, the women gathered in small groups, their conversations nervous and fragmented. Rumors had spread through the camp like wildfire. The Americans were coming. The war was over. The Emperor himself had spoken on the radio, though none of them had heard it. Everything they had known, everything they had been taught to believe, was about to collide with reality in a way that would shatter their understanding of the world and the nature of their enemy. September 3rd, 1945 arrived, with the rumble of vengeance that sent terror coursing through the camp. Keiko stood frozen near the eastern fence, her hand gripping Yuki's trembling arm as the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. The women had spent the previous weeks in agonizing anticipation, their meager food supplies dwindling, their isolation complete. Some had fashioned crude weapons from bamboo and scrap metal, determined to resist. Others had written farewell letters to families they might never see again, tucking them into the hems of their clothing. The suicide pact discussed weeks earlier now seemed inevitable to many. The first American vehicle appeared through the gates, a massive, olive-drab truck that seemed impossibly large compared to the small Japanese military vehicles the women had known. But it was not the machines that caused the collective gasp that rippled through the assembled prisoners. It was the men who emerged from them. Keiko's eyes widened in disbelief. These were not the demons from the propaganda posters. These were not the snarling, bloodthirsty savages depicted in the newsreels she had watched in Tokyo theaters before the war. The American soldiers were enormous, that much was true. Many stood well over 6 feet tall, their frames broad and muscular in a way that seemed almost impossible. But their faces were clean-shaven, their uniforms crisp, despite the tropical heat, and most startling of all, they were smiling. actual smiles. The predatory grins of propaganda, but genuine expressions of relief and what appeared to be kindness. Keiko felt her legs weaken beneath her. "Are these even real men?" whispered Tomoko Sato, a widow from Osaka who stood beside her. "They look like they stepped out of a Hollywood film." The comparison was apt. Many of these soldiers were farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit, young men who had joined the military out of duty or necessity. Lieutenant James Morrison, a 24-year-old officer from Nebraska, was the first to approach the group of Japanese women. He removed his helmet, revealing sandy blonde hair that seemed to glow in the tropical sunlight. He spoke in halting, accented Japanese, clearly learned from a military phrasebook. "We are here to help. You are safe now. The war is over." The words seemed impossible. Safe? From these giants? Yet Lieutenant Morrison's blue eyes held no malice, no cruelty. Instead, there was something that looked remarkably like concern. He gestured to other soldiers who began unloading crates from the trucks. The women watched in stunned silence as the Americans produced boxes of food, not the meager rations they had survived on for months, but actual provisions. Canned fruits, chocolate bars, powdered milk, and something the soldiers called spam, which Keiko would later learn was a type of processed meat that American troops themselves complained about, yet seemed like luxury to starving prisoners. Medics moved among the women, their movements careful and non-threatening. One approached Keiko with a medical bag, pointing to a festering cut on her arm that she had been ignoring for weeks. The medic, a corporal named Robert Chen, whose parents had emigrated from China to San Francisco, cleaned and bandaged the wound with a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes. He offered her water from his own canteen, an act of personal sacrifice that defied everything she had been taught about American selfishness and barbarity. As the afternoon progressed, the disconnect between expectation and reality grew more profound. The Americans distributed blankets, set up medical tents, and even produced a portable kitchen where hot meals were prepared. Young Yuki, who had been clutching a sharpened bamboo stake beneath her threadbare kimono, slowly let it fall to the ground. An American soldier, barely older than herself, noticed her distress and offered her a chocolate bar. The gesture was so simple, so human, that Yuki burst into tears not from fear, but from the overwhelming confusion of having one's entire worldview demolished in a single afternoon. September 10th, 1945, found Keiko sitting in the shade of a newly erected medical tent, watching the transformation of the camp with eyes that still struggled to process what they witnessed. 1 week had passed since the Americans arrived, and in that time the Japanese women had begun the painful process of reconciling propaganda with reality. The cognitive dissonance was almost physical and nauseating, disconnect between what they had been taught and what they now experienced daily. The American soldiers had established a routine. Each morning, they brought fresh water, food supplies, and medical attention. They had even constructed proper latrines and bathing facilities, respecting the women's privacy in ways that seemed almost excessive. Corporal Thomas Williams, a soft-spoken man from Tennessee, had spent 3 days building a bamboo screen around the women's washing area without being asked, simply because he noticed their discomfort. Such consideration from the enemy was incomprehensible within the framework of Japanese wartime propaganda. Dr. Elizabeth Patterson arrived on the 5th day, the first American woman many of the Japanese prisoners had ever encountered. A captain in the Army Nurse Corps, she was tall, confident, and possessed a matter-of-fact competence that both intimidated and impressed Keiko. Dr. Patterson spoke no Japanese, but her medical examinations were thorough and compassionate. She treated cases of malnutrition, tropical diseases, and the psychological trauma that was beginning to surface as the women's immediate fear subsided. Through a translator, Japanese-American soldier named Kenneth Yamamoto from Los Angeles, Dr. Patterson explained each procedure, each medication, always asking permission before touching a patient. It was Yamamoto-san whose presence proved most unsettling to the internees. Here was a man of Japanese descent, wearing an American uniform, fighting for the country that had imprisoned his own family in domestic internment camps. According to research preserved in the Go for Broke National Education Center archives, over 33,000 Japanese Americans served in the U.S. military during the war, often while their families remained behind barbed wire in places like Manzanar and Heart Mountain. Yamamoto spoke to the women about his experiences, his matter-of-fact acceptance of his dual identity, challenging everything they understood about loyalty, honor, and national identity. Tomoko, the widow from Osaka, spent hours in conversation with Yamamoto through the fence that was gradually being dismantled. She learned about American cities, about the mixture of cultures, about concepts like civil rights and democracy that seemed simultaneously foreign and appealing. Her husband had died believing he was protecting Japan from American imperialism. Now she wondered what he had truly been protecting and from whom. The psychological transformation was not universal or immediate. Several of the older women remained deeply suspicious, convinced this kindness was an elaborate trick, a softening before the inevitable brutality. Sachiko Ito, a 40-year-old woman from Hiroshima who had not yet learned of her city's fate, organized a group that maintained distance from the Americans, speaking to them only when absolutely necessary. She reminded the others of their duty, their honor, the sacrifices their brothers and sons had made. Yet even Sachiko could not deny the evidence before her eyes. The American soldiers who shared their own rations when supplies ran low, the medics who worked through the night when dysentery swept through the camp, the engineers who rigged a generator to provide electric lighting for the first time in months. Young Yuki had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation. She had begun helping in the medical tent, her limited English improving daily as she worked alongside Dr. Patterson and the American medics. She learned to change bandages, to administer basic medicines, to comfort those still too frightened to accept help. In the evenings, she would sit with Keiko and describe what she had seen, that Datha, American soldier who cried when he saw photographs of the women's children, the chaplain who offered to help them write letters home, the commanding officer who personally ensured that Japanese dietary restrictions were respected in the mess preparations. September 20th, 1945, brought news that would fracture the last remnants of the women's previous understanding. A U.S. Army information officer arrived with Japanese-language newspapers, official documents, and most devastating of all, photographs. The women gathered in the main assembly area as Lieutenant Morrison, through Yamamoto's translation, prepared to brief them on what had actually transpired during the final months of the war. Keiko watched as the officer carefully laid out a series of images on a makeshift table. The first showed a mushroom cloud rising above a city. Hiroshima, Yamamoto said quietly. August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb. Single weapon that destroyed most of the city. The women moved closer, their faces registering confusion, then disbelief, then horror. Sachiko Ito pushed to the front, her hands trembling as she reached for the photograph. Her sister lived in Hiroshima. Her nephews attended school there. The next image showed Nagasaki, 3 days later. Another flash, another city consumed by fire and radiation. Lieutenant Morrison spoke in measured tones while Yamamoto translated, explaining what the Americans knew about the casualties, estimates ranging from 70,000 to over 100,000 dead in Hiroshima alone, with thousands more dying in the weeks and months that followed from radiation sickness. The numbers seemed impossible, abstract. How could a single bomb kill so many? But it was the photographs of the surrender that truly shattered the last illusions. Emperor Hirohito, the living god, standing in formal dress beside General Douglas MacArthur, who towered over him in casual, khaki, hands casually at his sides. The emperor, their sacred ruler, whose voice most had never heard, until the surrender broadcast, looking small, human, and defeated. Ko felt something break inside her chest. If the emperor himself had surrendered, if he had submitted to these Americans, then what had all the sacrifice been for? The information officer distributed newspapers, the Asahi Shimbun, and other Japanese publications that had begun printing under Allied supervision. The women read accounts of the war's final days, the Soviet declaration of war against Japan on August 8th, the invasion of Manchuria, the combined pressure that had forced the imperial government to accept unconditional surrender. They read about the casualties at Okinawa, the firebombing of Tokyo, the systematic destruction of Japanese cities that had preceded the atomic weapons. Historical documentation from the National Archives indicates that American forces made concerted efforts to educate Japanese prisoners about the war's conclusion, understanding that many had been completely isolated from accurate information. But reading words on a page was different from accepting their truth. Many of the women wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence. Sachiko Ito collapsed, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief, from the shattering of a worldview, the dissolution of meaning itself. Yuki approached Keiko that evening, her young face haggard with exhaustion and emotional turmoil. "My father told me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that the Americans were demons. He said they would defile us, torture us, that death was preferable to capture. But Keiko-san, they have been kinder to us than our own officers were in the final months. How do I understand this? How do I make sense of what we were told versus what I see?" The question hung in the humid night air. Around them, other women grappled with the same cognitive dissonance. The Americans had killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians with their bombs and firebombing campaigns. This was undeniable. Yet these same Americans now fed them, clothed them, treated their illnesses, and prepared to send them home. The propaganda had painted them as monsters, but the reality was far more complex and troubling than simple demonization allowed. Corporal Chen, the medic who had first treated Keiko's arm, sat with a group of women that evening, sharing photographs of his family. His grandparents had fled China during the Qing dynasty's collapse, seeking opportunity in America. His parents ran a laundry in San Francisco. He had 2 sisters in college, showed them pictures of his girlfriend, a nurse in California, her smile bright and hopeful. He spoke about wanting to become a doctor after the war, about the GI Bill that would pay for his education. This was the enemy? This young man with dreams and family photographs and gentle hands that healed rather than hurt. October 1st, 1945, marked a turning point when the women were permitted to listen to armed forces radio broadcasts, including translated programs about the war's conclusion. Keiko sat with a group of 30 other women around a portable radio as voices crackled through the static, describing the occupation of Japan. The arrival of MacArthur in Tokyo, the beginning of what Americans called democratization, and what many Japanese feared was simply another word for conquest. But it was a different broadcast that proved most illuminating and most disturbing. A journalist named John Hersey had begun interviewing survivors from Hiroshima, and excerpts from these accounts were being translated and broadcast. The women listened to descriptions of the flash, the fire, the black rain, the mysterious illness that followed. They heard Japanese doctors describing symptoms they did not understand: hair falling out, bleeding from the gums, a strange lethargy that preceded death. The scale of suffering was immense, incomprehensible. Yet in the same broadcast, they heard American veterans speaking about their own experiences. A Marine described the Battle of Iwo Jima, where nearly 7,000 Americans died, taking an island just 8 square miles in size. Another spoke of Okinawa, where over 12,000 American servicemen were killed and tens of thousands wounded in less than 3 months. A Navy pilot described kamikaze attacks, the terror of watching suicide planes deliberately crash into ships, killing crews who had no chance to defend themselves. The broadcast did not justify the atomic bombs, but it provided context that Japanese propaganda had systematically suppressed. Tomoko found herself in an unexpected conversation with Sergeant Robert Martinez, a Mexican-American soldier from Texas who had fought through the Pacific campaigns. Through Yamamoto's translation, Martinez spoke frankly about his experiences. "I was terrified," he admitted. "At Tarawa, I watched friends die in the water before we even reached the beach. At Saipan, we found caves where entire families had killed themselves rather than surrender. Mothers had killed their own children. We tried to tell them we wouldn't hurt them, but they didn't believe us. We were just kids ourselves, and we didn't understand why they were so afraid." His words carried no triumph, no satisfaction, just exhaustion and confusion. Tomoko realized that he too was trying to make sense of what he had experienced. The propaganda had told her that Americans delighted in death, that they were naturally violent and cruel. But Martinez spoke of war the way her own husband had in his final letters, as something terrible and necessary that left scars on everyone it touched. Dr. Patterson organized group discussions, recognizing that the women needed to process their trauma collectively. These sessions revealed the layers of deception they had all experienced. They learned that the stories of American atrocities were largely fabricated or exaggerated from isolated incidents. While systematic Japanese war crimes, the rape of Nanking, the Bataan Death March, the brutal treatment of prisoners throughout the Pacific had been hidden from the civilian population or justified as necessary military actions against subhuman enemies. The most painful revelations came from Yamamoto, whose family history embodied the complexity both sides preferred to ignore. His parents had been imprisoned at Manzanar, a domestic internment camp in California where over 110,000 Japanese Americans, of them citizens, had been forcibly relocated after Pearl Harbor. "We were treated as enemies by the country of our birth," he explained. "Our property was seized, our rights suspended. But we were never starved, never tortured, never executed. And when we were given the chance to prove our loyalty, thousands of us volunteered to fight. It's not because we hated Japan, but because we believed in what America could be, even when it failed to live up to its ideals." This nuance, the ability to critique one's own country while still serving it, to acknowledge its failures while believing in its potential, was utterly foreign to women raised in a culture of absolute loyalty and unquestioning obedience. The emperor was divine, Japan was sacred. To question was to betray. And here was a man of Japanese blood wearing an American uniform, speaking casually about his government's failures while simultaneously defending his choice to serve. Young Yuki pressed him, "But how can you live with such contradiction? How can you serve a country that imprisoned your family?" Yamamoto smiled sadly, "Because I believe they were wrong to do it, and I believe they can learn to be better." In Japan, could you say the emperor was wrong? Could you work to change your government's policies? Here for all its faults, we can speak, we can protest, we can demand change. That freedom, that possibility, that's what I'm fighting for. October 15th. 1945 brought an unexpected visitor to the camp, a Japanese-American woman named Grace Kimura, who served as a civilian translator for the Allied forces. Her presence created an immediate stir among the internees. Here was a woman who looked Japanese, spoke perfect Japanese, yet wore Western clothing and carried herself with a confidence that seemed almost masculine by traditional standards. She was, the women quickly learned, a niece's second generation, born in Seattle to immigrant parents. Grace spent hours with the women, and her conversations revealed a world they had never imagined. She spoke of growing up in America, of attending university alongside white students, of working as a teacher before the war. She described the internment of her family, the loss of their small grocery store, years behind barbed wire in Idaho. But she also spoke of returning to Seattle after her release, of joining the military intelligence service despite everything, of using her language skills to help end the war more quickly. "I was angry," she told them frankly. "I am still angry. What they did to us was wrong, motivated by racism and fear. But I also knew that Imperial Japan was committing atrocities across Asia. I had relatives in Manchuria who wrote about what the Kuomintang army was doing to Chinese civilians. I couldn't support that, no matter how my adopted country had wronged me." Keiko found herself spending more and more time with Grace, drawn to her willingness to discuss uncomfortable truths. Grace brought books, English-language texts about democracy, women's suffrage, civil rights. She described a world where women could vote, own property independently, pursue careers beyond teaching and nursing. She spoke of Eleanor Roosevelt, of women working in factories during the war, of the gradual expansion of rights and opportunities. "You were taught that Western culture would destroy Japanese values," Grace explained. "But what if those values were already changing? What if the military government had frozen Japan in time, preventing natural evolution?" She showed them photographs of Tokyo before the war, women in Western dress, movie theaters, jazz clubs, democratic political movements. This was Japan, too, before the militarists took control. Progress doesn't mean abandoning your culture. It means choosing which parts to keep and which to let go. The medical tent had become an unexpected site of cultural exchange. Dr. Patterson, fascinated by traditional Japanese healing practices, asked the women to teach her what they knew. Keiko demonstrated acupressure techniques, explained the use of medicinal herbs, described the holistic approach to health that considered mind and body as inseparable. Dr. Patterson, in turn, explained germ theory, antibiotics, surgical procedures that could save lives previously thought beyond help. One afternoon, Corporal Williams approached Keiko with an unusual request. He had been writing letters to his mother in Tennessee, and he wanted to understand Japanese customs better so he could explain what he had witnessed. Through Yamamoto's translation, they spent hours discussing Japanese culture, the tea ceremony, the significance of cherry blossoms, the concept of giri and ninjo, duty and human feeling. Williams listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions, acknowledging beauty in traditions different from his own. "My mama always told me," Williams said, "that fear comes from not knowing, folks. She said people everywhere want pretty much the same thing: safety for their families, enough to eat, a chance for their children to have better lives." I reckon she was right. Y'all aren't so different from my sisters back home, just trying to survive a war you didn't start. This simple observation, the recognition of shared humanity, was revolutionary to women taught that. Racial and cultural differences created unbridgeable chasms. They had been told that Americans viewed Japanese as subhuman, yet here were soldiers who saw them as individuals, as mothers and daughters and wives, rather than enemy abstractions. Sachiko, who had maintained her distance longest, finally agreed to speak with Lieutenant Morrison. She had learned that her sister in Hiroshima had survived, though she was sick with radiation illness. The lieutenant arranged for her to send a message through Red Cross channels, navigating military bureaucracy to reunite a family separated by war. When the reply came weeks later, her sister was alive, being treated in a hospital. Asking Sachiko to come home, the older woman broke down in tears of gratitude. October 28, 1945 brought a reckoning of a different sort. A group of former Japanese soldiers captured during the same period but held separately were being processed for repatriation. The women watched as these men, emaciated, defeated, their uniforms in tatters, were loaded onto trucks for transport to collection centers. The contrast between their treatment and the women's experiences was stark and undeniable. One of the soldiers was Keiko's husband, Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura. She had not seen him in 6 months, had assumed him dead after the final collapse of Japanese defenses in the region. Now he stood before her, barely recognizable. His weight had dropped by at least 50 pounds. His face gaunt, his eyes hollow. But he was alive, and the Americans were sending him home. Their reunion was bittersweet and complicated. Hiroshi struggled to comprehend what Keiko told him about their captivity, about the Americans' treatment, about the truths they had learned. He had been raised in the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Army, indoctrinated in Bushido ideals that taught surrender was dishonorable, that death was preferable to capture. That he had survived was itself a source of shame. "They treated us according to the Geneva Conventions," Hiroshi said quietly, his voice carrying both wonder and confusion. "We were given food, medical care, allowed to write letters home. When I was sick with malaria, an American doctor stayed up all night monitoring my condition. Saved my life, Keiko. The enemy saved my life." He paused, struggling with words. "We were told they would torture us, execute us for sport. But except for the first days of combat, when both sides were still fighting, they were ... professional, correct, almost respectful." Yamamoto facilitated conversations between the former soldiers and their captors, sessions that revealed how both sides had been manipulated by propaganda. The American soldiers had been shown atrocity photographs, some real, some fabricated or exaggerated, that depicted Japanese forces committing horrible acts. The Japanese had been shown similar materials about American barbarity. Both groups had entered combat believing the other side to be monsters, only to discover complex human beings capable of both cruelty and compassion. Sergeant Martinez spoke frankly with a group of former Japanese soldiers about his experiences at Peleliu. "One of the war's bloodiest battles. We were told to take no prisoners," he admitted. "Command said you guys would never surrender, that you'd fake injuries and then detonate grenades when medics approached, and some did. I lost friends that way. So yeah, there were times we shot first and asked questions never. But that was war, and war makes people do things they'd never do otherwise." A former Japanese sergeant nodded slowly. "We were told to kill ourselves rather than be captured. The American soldiers would torture us for information, then execute us. Some officers shot soldiers who tried to surrender, called them traitors. Others committed seppuku when defeat became inevitable. I tried to do the same, but an American medic stopped me, wrestled the knife away, treated my wounds. I did not understand this. It violated everything I had been taught." Grace Kimura organized a historical education program, providing the internees with access to uncensored information about the war's broader context. They learned about the attack on Pearl Harbor, not the justified preemptive strike described in Japanese propaganda, but a surprise attack that killed over 2,000 people, many of them civilians. They read about the Bataan Death March, where thousands of Allied prisoners died from starvation, disease, and deliberate brutality. They saw photographs from Nanking, from Manila, from Burma, evidence of war crimes committed by Japanese forces across Asia. These revelations were devastating. Many of the women had family members who had served in these theaters. They'd celebrated their brothers' and sons' deployments, believed they were spreading prosperity and civilization. The truth was far darker. Young Yuki discovered that her uncle, an officer in the 14th Army, had participated in the Manila Massacre, where over 100,000 Filipino civilians died in a month of systematic violence. The hero of her childhood was responsible for atrocities that defied comprehension. But Grace also ensured they learned about American failures, the firebombing campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians, the racial prejudice that motivated some Allied soldiers, the atomic bombs that destroyed 2 cities in moments. She provided context about the decision to use these weapons. The estimates suggesting an invasion of Japan would cost millions of lives on both sides. The pressure to end the war before Soviet forces could claim more territory. She did not justify these actions, but she refused to present a simplistic narrative of good versus evil. War crimes are war crimes, Grace said firmly, regardless of who commits them. The Allies were not morally pure. No one in war ever is. But the Imperial Japanese government systematically lied to its people about both its own actions and those of its enemies. Breaking free from those lies is the first step toward building something better. November 10th. 1945 transformed the camp into something unexpected, a temporary community rather than a detention facility. The American forces, preparing for the massive logistical challenge of repatriating millions of Japanese civilians and soldiers, scattered across the Pacific, established a system that allowed the internees increasing autonomy. Keiko found herself serving as a liaison between the Japanese women and American administrators, her growing English proficiency and willingness to engage making her invaluable. The transformation in individual relationships was remarkable. Dr. Patterson and Keiko had developed a genuine friendship, collaborating on a medical handbook that combined Western and traditional Japanese healing practices. They worked side by side in the clinic, treating patients with a hybrid approach that acknowledged the value in both traditions. Patterson taught Keiko to suture wounds and administer penicillin. Keiko taught Patterson shiatsu massage and herbal remedies for tropical ailments. Corporal Chen had become something of a celebrity among the women after he successfully treated a case of sepsis that would have been fatal weeks earlier. He spent his evenings teaching basic first aid, using Yamamoto as translator, empowering the women with medical knowledge that might help them survive the difficult months ahead. Japan's infrastructure was shattered, its hospitals destroyed or overwhelmed, its medical supplies depleted. These skills might mean the difference between life and death when they returned home. Lieutenant Morrison organized cultural exchange evenings where American soldiers and Japanese internees shared music, food, and stories. The Americans taught the women to dance to swing music's scandalous at first, but gradually accepted as harmless fun. The women demonstrated traditional tea ceremony, flower arrangement, and calligraphy. These activities served a deeper purpose, humanizing both groups to each other, building relationships that transcended nationality and propaganda. One evening, Sergeant Martinez pulled out a guitar and began playing. His voice was rough but sincere as he sang folk songs from his Texas childhood. Tomoko, listening with tears streaming down her face, was reminded of her own husband who had loved music. She began to sing a traditional Japanese balota song of longing and loss that needed no translation. The combined voices, English and Japanese, created something beautiful from shared grief. Grace Kimura had launched an ambitious education program, teaching English classes and preparing the women for what they would face in occupied Japan. Spoke frankly about the changes coming, American forces controlling major cities, MacArthur as supreme commander, democratic reforms being imposed from above. Japan will be different, she warned. The military government is gone, the Zaibatsu conglomerates are being broken up, land reform is coming, women will get the vote, yes, the vote. You will have rights you've never had before, challenge is learning to use them. These concepts were revolutionary. The women had been raised in a patriarchal society where their primary duty was to family and nation, where individual rights were subordinate to collective harmony. They were being told they could own property, pursue careers, participate in government. For some like young Yuki, this was thrilling. For others, like Sachiko, it was terrifying, a dissolution of the natural order that had provided structure and meaning. The preparation for repatriation brought practical concerns into sharp focus. Japan was devastated, its major cities reduced to rubble, its economy shattered, food scarce, millions homeless. The American military government was providing aid, but conditions would be harsh. The women packed their meager belongings, accepted care packages of food and clothing from their former captors, and tried to imagine what home would look like now. Hiroshi Nakamura spent hours in conversation with American officers, trying to understand the occupation that awaited them. He learned about the new constitution being drafted, about Article 9 that would renounce war forever, about trials being prepared for war criminals. He learned that many in Japanese leadership would face justice for their actions, that the entire military structure that had dominated society for decades was being dismantled. "I feel like I am awakening from a dream," he told Keiko one evening, "or perhaps from a nightmare. Everything we believed, everything we were taught, it was built on lies. The emperor was not divine. Our cause was not just. We're not defending Asia from Western imperialism. We were creating our own brutal empire. How do we live with this knowledge?" Keiko had no easy answers. She was grappling with the same questions, the same disorienting collapse of certainty. But she had also seen something else during these months of captivity, the possibility of change, growth, of building something new from the ruins of the old. The Americans were not perfect saviors, but neither were they the demons of propaganda. They were human beings, flawed and complex, trying to do their best in impossible circumstances. November 25, 1945 was departure day. The women gathered their belongings, care packages from American soldiers, letters of transit, medical supplies, and photographs they had been given as gifts. Keiko carried a small notebook where Dr. Patterson had written her address in California, along with an invitation to correspond. When things stabilized, Patterson had said, "Perhaps you can visit, or I'll come to Japan. This doesn't have to be goodbye forever." The ships that would transport them home were American cargo vessels hastily converted to carry human cargo. The irony was not lost on anyone. Enemy ships becoming lifelines, tools of war repurposed for homecoming. As the women boarded, American soldiers lined the docks. Some waved, others saluted, many had tears in their eyes. These relationships, forged in such unusual circumstances, had become real. Saying goodbye was genuinely painful for both sides. Sergeant Martinez approached Tomoko, offering her a carefully wrapped package. Inside was his guitar pick and a photograph of himself with his family. "Out to remember," he said simply through Yamamoto's translation. "To remember that enemies can become friends, that wars end but people remain." Tomoko bowed deeply, traditional gesture of profound respect, then shocked everyone by embracing him in the Western fashion she had learned. It was a small act of cultural bridge building, but it symbolized everything that had changed. Corporal Chen gave Keiko his medic's handbook, annotations in the margins where he had added notes about treating tropical diseases. "Use this to help others," he said. "You have a gift for healing. Japan will need healers in the years ahead." Keiko accepted the gift with trembling hands, knowing it represented not just medical knowledge but a passing of trust, a belief in her ability to do good in a world that desperately needed it. Young Yuki spent her final hours with Lieutenant Morrison, who had become something of a protective older brother to her during the internment. He gave her a copy of the United States Constitution, translated into Japanese, along with a letter he had written explaining American democratic principles. "Your country will be different now," he told her. "These ideas, freedom of speech, equal protection under law, government by consent of the governed, they're going to be part of Japan's new foundation. Study them, use them, build something better." The voyage would take 2 weeks, sailing north through waters where naval battles had raged just months before. The ships passed islands that had been battlegrounds: Guadalcanal, the Solomons, names that evoked thousands of deaths on both sides. Now these waters were quiet, marked only by occasional debris and the ghosts of ships that would never surface again. The women stood at the rails, watching the Pacific roll endlessly toward a homeland many feared they would not recognize. Grace Kimura remained with them for the journey, continuing her education programs. She organized discussions about what to expect, how to navigate the occupation, where to find resources. She taught them phrases that might be useful: food ration office, displaced persons assistance, medical clinic. She prepared them for the psychological shock of seeing their cities destroyed, their familiar landmarks gone, their social order fundamentally altered. But grace also encouraged them to share their own stories, to process their experiences collectively. Keiko spoke about her journey from accepting propaganda to questioning it, from fear to understanding, from hatred to something more complex and nuanced. Sachiko, the oldest among them, talked about her evolving perspective on honor and duty, how she had come to see that blind obedience was not virtue, but abdication of moral responsibility. Yuki described her determination to become a teacher, to educate the next generation differently, to encourage critical thinking rather than rote acceptance. The ship made a brief stop at Okinawa, and the devastation shocked even those who thought they were prepared. The island had been beautiful once, according to older passengers who remembered it from before the war. Now it was a wasteland of destroyed villages, cratered landscapes, and makeshift refugee camps. Over 100,000 Okinawan civilians had died during the 3-month battle, caught between American bombardment and Japanese forces who had treated them as expendable shields. They witnessed American reconstruction efforts, engineers rebuilding roads, medical teams treating survivors, supply operations, distributing food, but they also saw the massive military presence, the permanent-looking bases being constructed, the transformation of Okinawa into a forward operating station for the occupation of Japan. The message was clear. Japan had not just lost the war. It had lost control of its own destiny, at least temporarily. As they sailed closer to the Japanese mainland, tension aboard ship increased. These women were returning to an uncertain future. Many had lost family members in combat, in air raids, from the atomic bombs. Their homes might be destroyed, their livelihoods gone. The social structure that had defined their roles and identities had been shattered. They were sailing toward a country that no longer existed, except in memory and imagination. On the final night before landfall, Keiko stood at the rail, watching the stars. Hiroshi joined her, and they stood in silence for a long moment. "I keep thinking about the soldiers I commanded," he finally said. "So many of them died believing lies. They thought they were heroes, saviors of Asia, defenders of the divine emperor. But we were just pawns in a game played by men who never had to face the consequences of their decisions. I survived, and I don't know if that's a blessing or a curse. I have to live knowing what I participated in, what I failed to question." Keiko took his hand. "We were all complicit," she said quietly. "By believing, by not questioning, by supporting the system even when we saw its cruelty. But we can't change the past. We can only choose what we do now, how we build the future. The Americans gave us something unexpected. Not just survival, but perspective. We saw our enemy's humanity, and in doing so, we were forced to confront our own. That's a gift, even if it's painful." December 8th, 1945, 4 years to the day, after Pearl Harbor, Keiko Nakamura stood on the deck as the ship entered Tokyo. The date's significance was not lost on anyone aboard. What had begun with that attack had led to millions of deaths, 2 atomic bombs, and the complete transformation of Japanese society. Now they were returning to witness the aftermath. The sight of Tokyo was devastating. The great city that had been home to over 7 million people was largely gone. Mile after mile of blackened ruins stretched as far as the eye could see. The firebombing campaign of March 10, 1945 alone had killed over 100,000 people in a single night, destroying 16 square miles of the city. Subsequent raids had consumed what remained. Only concrete structures and stone temples still stood, lonely monuments in a sea of devastation. American ships crowded the harbor, battleships, cruisers, transport vessels, a massive armada that demonstrated absolute victory. The battleship Missouri, where the surrender had been signed months earlier, sat at anchor, a steel symbol of Japan's defeat. Rising sun flags that had once inspired terror across Asia now flew subordinate to the stars and stripes, marking buildings occupied by Allied forces. The women disembarked into a city transformed beyond recognition. American military police directed traffic, their white helmets and armbands marking them as the new authorities. Japanese civilians moved through the ruins like ghosts. Many still wearing wartime emergency clothing, their faces gaunt from malnutrition. Children begged for food from American soldiers, who often shared their rations despite regulations against fraternization. Keiko and Hiroshi made their way through the destruction toward what had been their neighborhood in Yokohama. The journey that once took an hour now required an entire day, navigating through rubble-choked streets across makeshift bridges replacing those destroyed by bombing. Along the way, they saw evidence of occupation American checkpoints, billboards in English announcing regulations. Japanese citizens queuing at distribution centers for rice rations provided by the occupying forces. Their home was gone, not damaged gone. Nothing remained but a foundation and a few charred timbers. Keiko stood in the empty space where her life had been, trying to find some emotional response, but she felt only numbness. So much had been destroyed that this personal loss seemed almost insignificant. Around them, former neighbors picked through ruins, searching for anything salvageable, any connection to the lives they had lived before. But they also found unexpected resources. The American military government had established relief stations, and Keiko's medical training immediately made her valuable. She reported to a clinic run jointly by Japanese doctors and American military medical personnel, a collaboration that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Dr. Patterson had written ahead, and Keiko's name was already on a list of trained personnel needed desperately in a city where disease, malnutrition, and trauma were epidemic. The clinic was housed in one of the few surviving concrete buildings, and Keiko found herself working alongside both former enemies and former allies. An American Army nurse named Lieutenant Sarah Chunno, relation to Corporal Chen, supervised the facility. She greeted Keiko warmly, explained the procedures, and immediately put her to work treating cases of tuberculosis, dysentery, and malnutrition. The need was overwhelming, the resources inadequate, but they did what they could. Hiroshi struggled more with the new reality. As a former military officer, he was required to register with occupation authorities and undergo screening to determine if he would face war crimes charges. His unit had not participated in any major atrocities, a matter of luck rather than virtue, so he was cleared. But the experience of being interrogated by American officers, of having to account for his service to what was now officially deemed an aggressive, criminal regime, was profoundly humiliating. Yet he also witnessed something unexpected. The American occupation, while clearly imposed by force, was not the brutal subjugation propaganda had predicted. General MacArthur's headquarters was working with Japanese officials to establish new systems of governance. Food aid was arriving, preventing mass starvation. Plans were being drawn for reconstruction. Schools were reopening, though with revised curricula that eliminated militaristic propaganda and introduced democratic principles. Sachiko Ito reunited with her sister, who had survived Hiroshima but was sick with radiation illness. The Americans had established special hospitals for Hibakusha atomic bomb survivors, where doctors from both nations tried to understand and treat conditions they had never encountered before. Sachiko watched American physicians work to save her sister's life, using experimental treatments and showing genuine compassion for victims of their own weapon. The moral complexity of this situation defied easy judgment. Young Yuki found work at one of the newly reopening schools, helping to teach English to children who would grow up in an occupied country where knowing the conqueror's language was essential. She used the materials Lieutenant Morrison had given her, teaching not just vocabulary but concepts, democracy, individual rights, equality under law. Her students were hungry for this knowledge, having been starved of honest information for years. The new Japanese constitution was promulgated in the spring of 1946, and Keiko attended a public reading of its text. Article 9 renounced war forever, declaring that Japan would maintain no military forces. Article 14 proclaimed equality under the law regardless of race, creed, sex, or social status, revolutionary in a society that had been rigidly hierarchical for centuries. Article 24 guaranteed equal rights in marriage, property ownership, and inheritance, transforming women's legal status overnight. These changes met mixed reactions. Traditionalists saw them as foreign impositions, a destruction of Japanese culture and values. Progressives, including many women who had suffered under the old system, embraced them as long overdue reforms. Keiko found herself somewhere in between, grateful for new opportunities while mourning aspects of traditional culture being swept away in the rush to modernize. She began corresponding with Dr. Patterson. Letters that took weeks to travel between California and Tokyo. They discussed medical techniques, shared personal news, and reflected on their unlikely friendship. Patterson wrote about American veterans struggling to readjust to civilian life, carrying psychological scars from battles in jungles and on islands. Keiko wrote about Japan's struggle to rebuild not just buildings, but identity itself, to understand how a nation that had believed itself divinely destined for greatness had fallen so completely. 1 year after her return, Keiko stood in front of a medical school, class women and men studying together, another revolution. She taught them not just Western medicine, but the importance of cultural humility, of recognizing that no single tradition held all answers. She told them about her time as a prisoner of war, about the Americans who had treated her with unexpected kindness, about the painful process of learning that everything she had believed about her enemy was wrong. "We were taught that Americans were demons," she told her students. "This was a lie. But we were also taught that we Japanese were superior, that our cause was just, that our emperor was divine. These were also lies. The truth is more complicated and more difficult than propaganda allows. We are all human beings, capable of both great cruelty and great compassion. Which we choose depends not on our nationality, but on our willingness to see others as equally human, equally deserving of dignity and respect." The question Tomoko had asked on that first shocking day, "Are these even real men?" now seemed almost quaint in its naivete. Of course, they were real men. Real, flawed, complex human beings, shaped by their own cultures and propagandas, capable of both killing in war and showing mercy in victory. The shock had not been their inhumanity, but their humanity. A humanity that shattered the comfortable certainties of wartime propaganda and forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths. Japan rebuilt, slowly and painfully. The ruins of Tokyo gave way to new construction. American occupation gradually softened into alliance. Former enemies became partners in building a new Pacific order. But for Keiko and the other women who had experienced that jarring transition from expectation to reality, from propaganda to truth, the memory remained vivid. They had stood at the intersection of two worlds, forced to choose between comfortable lies and difficult truths. They had chosen truth, and in doing so, had helped build a different future, one where the enemy could become a friend, where former hatreds could evolve into understanding, where the question, "Are these even real men?" could be answered with hard-won wisdom. They were, and so were we. And in recognizing our shared humanity was the first step toward ensuring such devastation would never happen again. The story of these Japanese women prisoners of war, documented in various post-war memoirs and historical records, preserved in institutions like the National Archives and the Library of Congress, represents a small but significant chapter in the larger narrative of war, propaganda, and reconciliation. Their experiences illuminate how governments manipulate perception, how quickly enemies can become friends when propaganda's veil is lifted, and how the hardest truths are often those that force us to see our own complicity in systems of lies. Keiko lived to see the 50th anniversary of the war's end. Witnessing Japan's transformation into a peaceful, prosperous democracy, allied with the nation it had once fought so bitterly. She never forgot that moment of shock when she first saw American soldiers, when everything she believed was challenged in an instant, forcing her to rebuild her understanding of the world from the ground up. It was, she often reflected, the most educational moment of her life, though the tuition had been paid in suffering, loss, and the painful dissolution of comforting certainties. The lesson endures. Propaganda thrives in isolation, and truth emerges through human connection. When we see each other clearly not as abstractions or stereotypes, but as individuals with hopes, fears, families, and dreams, the myths that enable war begin to crumble. The shock those Japanese women experienced was not just about American soldiers being different than expected. It was about confronting the reality that they themselves had been deceived, that their own government had lied to them, and that rebuilding required acknowledging these uncomfortable truths. In the end, the most profound shock was not discovering who the Americans really were, but discovering what the Japanese themselves had become, choosing, despite everything, to become something different, something better in the ashes of total defeat.